CB Forgotston, Elliott Stonecipher join us here on the program. And gentlemen, thanks so much for being with me today, live at Katie's Restaurant.
Good to be here, Eric.
Thank you for having us. I'm glad Elliott could join since he's kind of handicapped driving and talking.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Elliott. Elliott, of course, in route back from a speaking engagement, it says for our audience today, going to pull over and get involved in this discussion. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. First of all, and let's take Elliott first. Elliott, your impressions, your thoughts on the Ray Nagin indictment.
Well, it would have been easy for us, especially those of us who keep up. I mean, we knew it was coming. They've been in all kinds of plea negotiations with the Fed for a very long time. Others involved in the bribery have already pled guilty. They've already been sentenced. So for a lot of us, I guess, there was not any big surprise in the event. But I think it's a big deal, which was the point of the piece that I wrote once those indictments came down at the end of last week. And I think, Eric, the simplest way I know to put this is we in Louisiana and New Orleans area more specifically gathered in $140 billion worth of fees from American taxpayers, $4 billion worth of fees from private organizations and individuals and other nations, including third world nations that don't have the money. We took that money for rebuilding, and on top of that, what people don't know is special efforts had to be made on the front end because of the fear of corruption. Special efforts were made to use third parties to hold a lot of that money and put extra strings, if you will, on its use. All of that was to prevent what everybody expected, unfortunately, of Louisiana, a lot of corruption involving the money. When Ray Nagin used this as an opportunity to involve himself in these very lucrative bribes, it ought to be a real period at the end of the sentence about how bold corruption can be in Louisiana. We've got to ask ourselves, if you're Ray Nagin, through this process of gathering in and spending the money, why did you feel so comfortable doing the things that the federal government tells us by way of their indictment that he did? And my point is, put simply, nobody in Louisiana who is disposed toward corruption is one bit worried about what can happen to them. The fact that Ray Nagin is apparently going to plead guilty to various of these charges is interesting, but that's the tip of the iceberg, and even he wasn't really afraid of it happening.
CB, why don't you chime in? What are your thoughts as this indictment came down on Friday?
I thought of this quote popped into my mind by Abraham Lincoln. Nearly, and let me just back up. I knew Ray Nagin before he was in politics, and I actually thought Abraham Lincoln's quote popped into my mind. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And that's what happened to Ray Nagin and happens to many others. I recall in 2000 when Edwin Edwards was convicted of taking bribes for handing out casino licenses. The media was calling me from literally all over the country and especially locally saying, CB, don't you think this signals the end of corruption in Louisiana, that now that somebody as powerful as Edwin Edwards has been convicted? And I said, you just don't understand the history of Louisiana. And I think Elliott has referred to this in other instances about we have a culture in this state that seems to be accepting of corruption. And when you have a culture that is accepting of corruption, you're going to get corruption. Because as Elliott just pointed out, when you're talking about those kind of billions of dollars, it tests every man's character, and especially those in the power to do something about it. So It was disappointing about Ray Nagin, but not the least bit surprising, at least not since Katrina for me. I made a lot of statements about him immediately following Katrina and his character and other things, and people criticized me because he was still popular then. And then he turned out to be exactly what I suggested he was.
Elliott Stonecipher, and of course C.B. Forgotston, our guest. We're live at Katie's Restaurant and Bar in Mid-City. Elliott, let's talk a little bit about the cause and effect of political corruption in this state. Again, when you look at where we are post-Katrina, and we can go back to the Huey Long days, is it the system of government? Why are we seeing so many corrupt politicians here in Louisiana, and then that continues to this day?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for us to remember that in almost every case, when a politician, a public official, whether elected or appointed, takes bribes, there is always another person who is not a politician or public official who set that up. And that's a way to refer back to what CV is saying about the culture of corruption. I think we all have to take a few minutes just to let it kind of settle in, and we don't do this very well. But what happens in Louisiana that is pretty unique is that we are totally dependent on federal authorities to do anything about corruption here. It's not that the Constitution or our statutes prevent local police departments, local sheriffs, the state police, local DAs. They are not prevented from doing something about public corruption, especially where particular state statutes would go much more aggressively at a situation than federal statutes do. And I know of some of those instances have been involved on the right side of seeing how that works. We set up an ethics administration in Louisiana in 1964, and it was set up by the then new and supposedly reformed governor, John McKithen, and the man who many of us believe was really the most powerful man in Louisiana, Victor Busey, who was the head of the AFL-CIO.
Right.
And aside from anything else that we might want to say about either of those very strong personalities, the point is this. Governor McKithen, who always sought Vic Busey's counsel, thought that the best way to keep local sheriffs and DAs from having to investigate and prosecute corruption cases at the parish or local level was to put an ethics system in place. And it was literally so people could say at the local level, look, that thing that you're saying is a corrupt act that you want us to do something about, that involves an elected official working in state government. You've got to take that complaint to the ethics board. They didn't bother to tell that person, oh, by the way, ethics is a civil procedure. This is not a criminal procedure at all, which means they didn't bother to tell people that it was just a joke. And as CB knows very, very well, we've gone full circle since Bobby Jindal was elected, and we took what was already a joke and was in a better position than it had been in a long time, right before Bobby Jindal was elected.
Yes.
And now we've turned it into a laughing stock, not just a joke. So not only do we only have kids doing anything about real public corruption, we have neutered any kind of effective enforcement in the civil procedure that is our ethics administration. What that means is we are sending word every way we can to everybody who wants close proximity to a public budget. We're sending them a message. Do it here. There's far less risk for you if you do it in Louisiana.
CB Forgotston, Elliott Stonecipher with us. Elliott, why aren't we seeing more district attorneys, more attorney generals, the attorney general for the state of Louisiana, as Elliott mentioned, sheriffs, local police chiefs, etc., going after political corruption in the state? CB?
Oh, me? Well,
Yes, please.
let me say I concur with the root problem as Elliott has pointed out, and I want to correct something, and I'll answer your question directly. We aren't seeing more corruption in Louisiana now than in history, and we aren't seeing any less. The difference is that Jim Letton was an aberration among prosecutors in the history of Louisiana. And he came in and decided to do his job and do it right and take on political corruption as one of the key platforms in his administration of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he held the job longer than I believe anyone else and held it under different party presidents. He pulled back what we all knew, those of us like Elliott and I who had worked in the bowels of government. Jim Letton opened it up for all to see, and it's really ugly, but it's not new. Now, as far as the local officials, Elliott hit the nail on the head. It is called scratch your back. It's mutual back scratching. They're all elected officials that usually get in trouble, and the DA and the sheriff and the judges are all elected. So they don't seem to want to anger the other elected officials. Now, let's talk specifically about the Attorney General. A lot of people raise questions about where's the Attorney General. I can tell you where he is. He's doing exactly what the Constitution tells him to do since 1974. In 1973, the district attorneys did not like the then Attorney General, Billy Gust. They couldn't control him, and sometimes he needed some controlling, but they wanted to make sure that he didn't come in and step on their territory. So the Constitution was changed, and the criminal jurisdiction, despite the fact every time somebody runs for Attorney General now, they talk about locking people up. They have no original criminal jurisdiction. The only way they can get involved in criminal matters locally is if the local district attorney invites them in. And sometimes they do that when there are conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. So the AG is really out of the whole equation. And that was the DA's answer to making themselves literally the most powerful elected official within their districts. They have absolute authority to prosecute or not prosecute. And the fact that they choose not to prosecute cannot be questioned. And so it's the system that we have, and the reason the system exists is because we, the people, don't demand anything different.
CB Forgotston, Elliott Stonecipher, our guest. We're live at Katie's Restaurant and Bar. Eric Asher with you until 1 o'clock this afternoon. Listen live, download my podcast at ericasher.com. Follow me on Twitter at Eric_Asher. We'll take a quick break. We'll return to Katie's Restaurant and Bar and continue our conversation on political corruption here in Louisiana with CB Forgotston and Elliott Stonecipher. Stay tuned. Two of the guys that have led the reform movement here in Louisiana, unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, it seems like the reform movement is dead, especially post-Katrina when we have so much promise for so many people from not just South Louisiana but from around the state that were fed up with political corruption, we're fed up with the way things were going. CB Forgotston and Elliott Stonecipher join us on the program as a tandem today. And Elliott, CB mentioned it, and again, I'd like you to piggyback on it as well. When we look at the Eastern District as opposed to the rest of the state, the difference between a guy like Jim Letton and what he has been able to accomplish in terms of going after political corruption and what's happening in the other districts around the state.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think that's an important part of this. I said earlier that we're totally dependent for all practical purposes on U.S. attorneys, the feds, whether it's the FBI handling the investigation or the U.S. attorney prosecuting the case. We're dependent on them. The rest of that story is we're dependent on U.S. attorneys regardless of district within Louisiana, having the same passion about public corruption that Jim Letton has always had. We can't assume that. And certainly we see in the Western District virtually no corruption cases. And for whatever reasons, we don't know what those are, but I will tell you the part that I can speak to. I spend plenty of time, whether it's in New Orleans or Houma last night, or Baton Rouge, or Lafayette, or Lake Charles, or Monroe. I know plenty enough about what's going on around the state to know that searching for a corrupt public official is doing your business in a target-rich environment. Any U.S. attorney that wants to do what Jim Letton did in Louisiana can do it at any time. And that brings up an interesting point. Now that Jim Letton is not doing what he has done these many years as U.S. attorney, we always talk about, and frankly, I get a lot of flack about, Elliott, it's one thing to know what the problems are. You know, what do you suggest we do about it? Well, CB's touched on the first thing. I suggest that people in Louisiana insist that they don't want to live in a corrupt place, and they elect people accordingly. But the second thing is, hey, if I'm Bobby Jindal, the first thing I'm going to do when a Jim Letton is available is I'm going to find a place for him to pursue public corruption cases in Louisiana, regardless of what that office is and what he needs to bring to that office, he or she. So there's a heck of a lot of stuff behind this, but CB is absolutely correct in pointing out when it's all said and done, the people of Louisiana don't seem to care enough to take advantage of situations that could make it better and to elect people, especially statewide elected officials who have a passion to finally stop this corruption disease in Louisiana.
CB, would it be fair to say that the reason why we've seen so many people targeted in the Eastern District of Louisiana when it comes to corruption is because of the amount of federal money? And you heard Elliott say earlier, $140 billion of federal funds that have been sent down to Louisiana, to southeast Louisiana, in the aftermath of the largest man-made disaster in the history of this country. Is it because of the fact that the federal money came down, that the president wanted to make sure that that money was protected?